All right, so we've all heard of the American Revolution, right? But did you know that Americans had been rebelling against England 100 years earlier? But was it really a fight for freedom and liberty? Or was it a petty power struggle between two men? We'll find out on this week's episode. Welcome to Learning Out Loud, a podcast that's hosted by me, Katie, where I tell you about the latest thing that I have learned in some of my favorite topics, mostly history, but we'll throw in some science and maybe even a little bit of self-help. And that's kind of all I have for the intro, so let's get into today's episode. All right, so I'm going to switch it up for the next few weeks, and I'm trying something new. I'm going to be doing a series on rebellions throughout U.S. history, starting with this episode in the 1600s, pre-United States of America, and I'll be going up to about like the 1960s. So obviously I can't cover all of America's rebellions because it's kind of our thing, you know. So I picked a handful that I feel like represent important themes in American history. All right, so back to the intro. If you hadn't guessed, we're going to be talking about Bacon's Rebellion, which occurred in Virginia in 1676. So let's get into it. And if you want to look up my sources, they will be in this episode's show notes. All right, so I think we should maybe start with a little bit of background of Virginia. How did it come about and when? So now we're in the 1500s. In 1584, a dude named Walter Raleigh gets a patent from Queen Elizabeth that allows him to claim and settle any New World lands that weren't already occupied by other Christians. Now, Christians being the key word here, because we all know that the New World area had been inhabited for a long ass time before Europeans came across it. But anyways, the next year, Queen Elizabeth knights Walter and makes him the governor of this new territory him and his crew discovered. And he names it, I'll let you guess. Yep, he names it Virginia in honor of his virgin queen. And so by 1587, Raleigh is sending out 3 ships of men and women with promises of land grants to anyone who establishes a colony on the Chesapeake Bay area. But the ships accidentally land in Roanoke, and that's where everyone ends up staying. A war breaks out between England and Spain shortly after this. So Raleigh can't send any more future Virginian colonists to the area. So it isn't until 1590 that English ships can go back to Roanoke and get the people to their proper place in the Chesapeake Bay. But when the expedition arrives to Roanoke, the place is completely abandoned with only a few mysterious carvings on the gates. And no one from the original ship is ever found. But that's a whole other episode that we can do because it's actually pretty creepy, and there's a lot of interesting theories about what happened to those colonists at Roanoke. But anywho, moving right along through Virginia's early history. By 1606, we now have King James, and he charters the Virginia Company of London and hopes to find a water passage to the Pacific Ocean by exploring the rivers across the New World and also officially establish the colony of Virginia. Cue the Virginia Company song from Disney's Pocahontas. And just a little fun fact, speaking of Disney's Pocahontas, she was probably about 10 to 12 years old when she first met John Smith, and she never actually marries him. She marries his homie, John Rolfe, when she's about 17 or 18, but only after being his prisoner for a year. So anyways, just clearing up some of those Disney rumors. Of the 105 men on the first ship of the Virginia Company, only 38 are alive 8 months after arriving. And from this point on, there are hostilities between the natives and the colonists. The natives were known as Powhatans, which was a confederation of many tribes that lived in the coastal regions of present-day North Carolina up to what is now known as Richmond, Virginia area. And then Jamestown, which we'll be talking about, is the territory of the Paspahe Indians, and there are other tribes that make up this confederation. They're the Kikatans, the Keokohaniks, the Wiyanoks, Appomattox, and the Kiskahaks. I'm sorry, I tried to look up all these pronunciations, but I'm pretty sure I butchered it. Nope, I'm not going to say that. Sorry, it's not funny. I looked up how to say all these names, and I tried my hardest. But anyways, all these tribes, they're also known as Algonquins. All right. So another important part of Virginia's history is when tobacco started getting planted, and that was by our boy John Rolfe in 1614. This would become Virginia's major cash crop, and in just a few years after that, Virginia is exporting about 2,500 pounds of tobacco to England, and then a couple decades later, it jumps up to 500,000 pounds every year. Going back to 1616, the Virginia Company offers investors land instead of money because its profits are actually pretty small. So this allows the establishment of private plantations and gives out land grants, which further encroaches on the native lands. And then the following year, a few years later, actually, in 1619, we see Virginia's first legislative assembly meet, as well as its first African slaves. This is also the first year that England demands taxes from the colony in the form of custom duties. And so for context, in the whole scheme of the New World, 1620 is when the Mayflower lands in Cape Cod. So Virginia's, kind of been established for a while before the Puritans come on the Mayflower. In 1622, the Powhatan Indians attack the settlements around Jamestown and kill about 350 men, women, and children. This is followed by an epidemic that kills about 700 more of the colonists and reduces the population to just 500. And later that year, the English attacked the Powhatan Indians and put a reward out for anyone who kills their chief, who is named Opechancanough. He is eventually killed by English soldiers about 20 years later. So this kind of sums up how Virginia was until the late 1600s, fighting with the natives, not having enough food, and basically just not being able to sustain life in the colony. And I really like this quote from the Library of Congress's timeline of Virginia. Quote, since 1606, approximately 7,300 immigrants have sailed for the colony, and 6,040 have died either en route or after arrival. The colony suffers from chronic food shortages and seems unable to get a sustenance from its own efforts. The greatest death rate has occurred between 1621 and 1623 during the period of Great Migration. The causes of the colony's low condition are numerous. Over-cultivation of tobacco, conflicts with the Powhatans, caused or aggravated by the colonists' dependence on them for food, poorly coordinated arrivals of colonists and supplies, and an unhealthy location and bad water supply that causes chronic ill health and high death rates. The Virginia Company is bankrupt and divided between factions. In sum, the problems are complex and various, and the company, riven by factional fighting, is unable to resolve them. Despite the loss of its charter, the company lingers on until 1630, end quote. So then, as that quote mentions, the Virginia Company loses its charter, and Virginia becomes under direct English control when our new king, King Charles, takes the throne. So by this time, we start to see a greater distinction between the wealthy elite Virginians who take up all the good farming land, and they start pushing out all the poorer people west into what is considered the frontier. So this puts the poorest people in more direct conflict with the native tribes, which puts them in danger of attack, but it's also good for the wealthy because they can kind of use the poor as a kind of buffer between them and the natives. And this is actually a common strategy that of the elite and the more wealthy people, colonists at this time. And we'll actually see this played out in a few of our other rebellion stories that I'll be sharing in the next few weeks. And you'll want to be having some whiskey on hand for that episode. Wink, wink. Anyway, here's another quote from the Library of Congress. By 1629, commerce and land accumulation began to create greater social and economic disparities in the Virginia colony. Merchants increased their connections with London and trade in indentured servants, slaves, and tobacco. Headrights award 50 acres of land per person to the individual responsible for bringing free men, indentured servants, or slaves into the colony. Estate owners accumulate additional land through the purchase of headrights, and a thriving commerce in them arises. End quote. So basically, if you had money already, you could come to Virginia and even make even more money and get land by buying up multiple headrights and setting up your tobacco plantation on the better land. Before Bacon's rebellion, there were African slaves in Virginia, but most of the work done on tobacco farms and plantations were actually done by white indentured servants. In a 1625 census, 10 Africans are listed as living in Jamestown, and then by the 1660s, there are fewer than 1,000 African enslaved people in Virginia, but by the 1680s, there are upward of 12,000. So this is kind of the time frame we're looking at now for Bacon's rebellion. And just for context, by 1860, like Civil War times, there were 550,000 enslaved African people in Virginia, which accounted for about 1/3 of the state's entire population. All right, so let's get some background on our main characters now that we kind of know a little bit about Virginia and where it's at. So we've got two dudes in this story. We've got Nathaniel Bacon, the rebel leader, and where the rebellion gets its name, and Sir William Berkeley, the governor of Virginia. So they are opposites in many ways. For instance, Berkeley was older. He was about 70 years old at the time. He was also a veteran of the English Civil Wars, a frontier Indian fighter, a playwright, scholar, and actually served as Virginia's governor in the 1640s. Whereas Bacon, on the other hand, he's only 29 years old. He is also known as a troublemaker and schemer who was sent to the colony by his dad in hopes that it would mature him. In an article that I wrote from NPS.gov, they mentioned that he was not a fan of labor, but I mean, same. Despite that, he was quite intelligent and eloquent. But here's the plot twist. They were cousins. Through marriage, but still. It was Berkeley's wife, Frances Culpeper, who was Bacon's cousin. And it kind of sounds like they were cool with each other before this whole rebellion thing, because Berkeley gave Bacon a substantial land grant and a seat on the council in 1675. So where did it all go wrong, you ask? But let's talk about a few more interesting facts about Nathaniel Bacon. So he married a woman named Elizabeth Duke in 1670 in England, and her dad was so against the marriage that he actually disinherited her. Although in 17th century England, I'm not sure what she would have inherited because she was a woman in the 1600s. But I didn't really want to get into inheritance laws in England, so we'll just have that be one of the mysteries. Nevertheless, Bacon's family seems well off enough to have a comfortable living, yet he still got caught up in some fraudulent land schemes, which ended up in a lawsuit. So this was probably the reason why his dad shipped him off to the American colonies, and crazily enough, this lawsuit lasted several years after Bacon's death. Bacon's dad had actually given him 1,800 pounds, and for reference, that's probably around $60 million US in 2015 when this article was written. When Bacon got to Virginia in 1674, he purchased 820 acres of land and acquired some more land by the falls of the James River. Sounds pretty nice. Bacon was also related to several of the most influential people in Virginia at the time, either by marriage or blood. And this is from encyclopediavirginia.org. He was, quote, well-connected, well-educated, intelligent, tall, and handsome, although somewhat melancholy and, in the view of some Virginians, unpleasantly arrogant, end quote. Despite that, his cousin, the governor, appoints Bacon to the council, like I said, within 7 months of Bacon's arrival. So again, I ask, what was his problem, dude? To answer that, we've kind of let's get into a little bit more of the specific details, what was going on in the colony that was leading up to this rebellion. So in 1675, the Virginia colonists were dealing with economic hard times, food shortages caused by awful natural disasters, and losses both financially and personally in their country's latest war. And you know what you do when this happens, right? We blame the minority group. Of course. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's crazy how we keep finding ourselves in similar situations throughout time. And one of my favorite history quotes is, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. This is why I find history so fascinating, because you can always see a through line connecting the past to the present. But anyway, back to the rebellion. So things all really start with a dispute between the Doeg Indians and a colonist named Thomas Matthews. Okay, so the Doegs claim Matthews had yet to pay them for some things that they had sold to him, and so they raided his plantation. A fight breaks out, and several of the Indians are killed. And from what I read, it didn't seem like there were any colonists who died during this raid. But regardless, the colonists retaliate, but they don't do their due diligence and attack the wrong group of Indians, the Susquehannocks. And so now you have two Indian groups that are pissed off, and they start large-scale raids across the colony. But don't worry, things get worse. Our boy Governor Berkeley tries to get things under control by inviting all the local tribe chiefs to a meeting to discuss the terms for peace, but the colonists end up killing several of those chiefs. Okay, so Berkeley was in a tough spot trying to prevent all-out war, but he had very upset Indians and very upset colonists, which was hard to find a compromise with. His initial actions were to take away the local Indians' ammunition and gunpowder, as well as declaring war on, quote, bad Indians, and reinforcing the defensive perimeter around the colony. The increase in defense led to higher taxes to pay for that army, which actually made the colonists even more discontent. The final straw for Bacon, at least, seems to be the ruling that Berkeley and his council made regarding trade with the local Indians. It was ruled that only a select few traders would be allowed to trade individually with the Indians. And guess who all those favored traders were? Yup, they were personal friends of Berkeley, who also was heavily involved in the fur trade with the Indians. The council set up a commission that monitored trading with the chosen few and to make sure that the Indians weren't trading any ammo or weapons. Our friend Bacon was one of the traders who was negatively impacted by this ruling and had also been denied a commission as a leader in the local militia by Berkeley. So Bacon was like, fuck this shit. I'm taking matters into my own hands. And so what does he do? He seizes some friendly Appomattox Indians who supposedly stole some of his corn. Berkeley publicly reprimands Bacon for this, but Bacon's like, you're not going to be doing anything about this. And a lot of the colonists were already pretty pissed off from all the things we had just talked about. Indian attacks, high taxes, natural disasters, food shortages. The list goes on. So they see this defiance from Bacon to Berkeley as this kind of, pivotal moment. And a lot of the colonists side with Berkeley. But we have a lot of people supporting Bacon. And so now we have the line in the sand drawn. So you got to choose sides at this point. The people who decide to join Bacon are generally poor and landless immigrants and white indentured servants. But what is really significant in his rebel group is that black enslaved people joined Bacon. So this was a multiracial rebellion against the government. And in what I imagine to be a very childlike, immature way, Bacon is like, well, I don't even need your stupid commission. I've bought my way into being elected a general by a group of volunteer Indian fighters. And he got this by promising to pay for all the costs of the little militia group he was creating. So of course they're going to vote him the general. Like, what else are they going to do? All right, so let's get into the rebellion. Bacon's first action as general of the local militia was driving the Pamukees from their land. Berkeley goes to try and stop Bacon with a group of about 300 well-armed, quote, gentlemen, but Bacon and his group are able to hide out in the forest. At this point, Berkeley officially declares Bacon a rebel and strips him of his council seat. He does offer, though, Bacon's men a full pardon if they peacefully went home. But Bacon and his men are like, no, thank you. And instead of surrendering, they go and attack the camp of friendly Occaneechi Indians and take all their beaver pellets. So then Berkeley tries a different tactic of agreeing to pardon Bacon so that he could be sent to England and tried before King Charles II. Now, I'm not really sure how that was supposed to convince Bacon to turn himself in, because he would still be going to England and tried there. So it doesn't really make sense to me. However, the House of Burgesses in Virginia did not agree to this and insisted that Bacon come in, admit wrongdoing, and beg Berkeley for forgiveness. And in an ironic twist of fate, Bacon was actually voted into the House of Burgesses by supportive local landowners who were sympathetic to his cause of fighting the Indians. So Bacon shows up to this assembly, and he is immediately captured and taken before Berkeley and the rest of the assembly and told to apologize. Berkeley pardons him and allows him to take his seat at the assembly. And, they proceed to talk about Virginian matters. It's not long, though, before a heated debate breaks out when it comes time to discuss Indian affairs. Bacon gets fed up and storms out of the assembly. But he returns a short time later with his militia, and they surround the State House, and he demands his official commission to fight the Indians. This time, Berkeley has had enough of Bacon's immature antics, and he confronts Bacon outside and dares Bacon to shoot him. Berkeley is quoted as saying, "Here, shoot me before God. Fair mark, shoot." But Bacon gets cold feet and is unable to shoot Berkeley. Berkeley, still trying to keep the peace, and finally actually seeing how much support Bacon has, is like, okay, fine. Like, you can have this volunteer commission with the local militia. But in typical immature Bacon style, Bacon now refuses that commission he had wanted this whole time, and now demands to be made general of all of the anti-Indian forces. Berkeley, probably in frustrated disbelief, refuses and starts to walk away. But Bacon and his men start going nuts and threatening to shoot the onlookers unless Berkeley gives Bacon what he wants. After a few tense moments, Berkeley finally agrees and allows Bacon to fight the Indians however he wants without government interference. Berkeley pretty much gives up at this point of trying to control Bacon in any way, and he retires to his home, but does a half-hearted coup a short time later. But support for Bacon was too strong, and Berkeley actually ends up fleeing to the Virginia coast. So Bacon dominated the Jamestown area from July to September of 1676. In an interesting coincidence, Bacon issues his, quote, Declaration of the People almost 100 years before the Declaration of Independence on July 30th, 1676. In his declaration, Bacon states that Berkeley is corrupt, plays favorites, and protected the Indians for his own selfish purposes. He also made his supporters swear an oath to him in which the supporter swore their loyalty to Bacon in any manner necessary. In a letter Berkeley wrote to a friend in London, he said of Bacon, quote, "How miserable that man is. that governs a people where 6 of the 7 at least are poor, indebted, discontented, and armed, end quote. I thought this quote was really funny because Berkeley, who is a much older dude, kind of sees Bacon as this disgruntled child who is playing make-believe general. And although it's a pretty sick burn, I think him not taking Bacon seriously probably made this whole ordeal last a bit longer than necessary. But Berkeley wouldn't stay gone for long. He had actually been secretly having his men infiltrate Bacon's militia, and when they had enough double agents, they were able to capture the men Bacon had sent to capture Berkeley, while Bacon went to go fight more Indians, of course. So Berkeley takes these captive men and his own men and retakes Jamestown and the surrounding area while Bacon's away. So Bacon doesn't know any of this is going on because, again, this is the 1600s. They don't have any sort of fast communication. So he goes back to Jamestown, but sees that it's heavily fortified by Berkeley and his people now. This doesn't deter Bacon. He attempts to lay siege to Jamestown several times and even kidnaps several wives of Berkeley's biggest supporters. But nothing seemed to be working for Bacon, so as a last resort, he just decides to burn Jamestown to the ground on September 19th. Although one of the articles I read said he saved a lot of valuable records from the State House, so I guess thanks? As Bacon became more unhinged, he lost more and more support, and he failed to convince his supporters to even capture Berkeley as they saw him leaving Jamestown. But even though Bacon was losing support, this rebellion comes to an abrupt stop when Bacon suddenly dies on October 26, 1676. It is said that he died of the, quote, bloody flux, which is dysentery, and also, quote, lousy disease, quote, end quote, which is body lice. So that's really gross. I Googled, can you die from body lice? And it looks like for the most part, no. The lice themselves cannot kill you. However, the lice bites could become infected and that could lead to problems. And again, this is the 1600s, so probably his bites were grossly infected. His body was never recovered, and some think his soldiers may have burned his body. A little jingle that was actually made about Bacon's death goes like this. Bacon is dead. I'm sorry at my heart that lice and flux should take the hangman's part. With Bacon's death, Berkeley is able to regain complete control of Jamestown, and he had the rest of the major leaders of the rebellion hanged, which totaled to about 23 men. Some articles I read said that it was a lot more, but for sure, like about 20 people. At the end of the day, it looks like there was about 8 colonial white men that were killed in Bacon's raids against the Indians, but it doesn't appear that any colonists died in the fighting between Berkeley and Bacon's men. But not surprisingly, we don't know how many Indians were killed in Bacon's campaigns. Berkeley also seized all the rebel property without trial. However, Berkeley's, quote, victory was short-lived because he was relieved of his governorship after an investigative committee from England sent their reports to King Charles II. And sadly, Berkeley's story doesn't get much better. He decides he is going to appeal directly to the king, but he dies in England before being able to plead his case, less than a year after the rebellion ended in July of 1677. So let's talk about some of the ramifications and aftermath of Bacon's rebellion. With this being almost 100 years before the American Revolution, and one way of looking at it is Bacon fighting against an unfair government that unfairly taxed the colonists and didn't protect them from Indian violence and played favoritism and benefited, friends of the government. So they rebelled. Seeing it in this light, I was wondering if any of the founding fathers in the late 1700s used Bacon's rebellion as an example or referenced it in any of their writings. I did find some documents from Thomas Jefferson talking about Bacon's rebellion, and it's pretty interesting. Okay, so you know how this whole rebellion kicked off? Remember I was talking about that guy, Thomas Matthews, supposedly owing the Indians money? Well, coincidentally, this guy also wrote an account of the whole Bacon's rebellion about 30 years after it happened in 1705. His account is obviously very biased, and he essentially blames the Indians for everything and paints Bacon as a hero. But as the saying goes, history is written by the victors, so his version was not super well known until the early 1800s. But Matthew's version of the story was gifted to Thomas Jefferson in 1803. Jefferson saw Matthew's manuscript as proof that Bacon was a patriot. Thomas Jefferson wrote, quote, "If this little book speaks the truth, Nathaniel Bacon will be no longer regarded as a rebel, but as a patriot. His name will be rescued from the infamy which has adhered to it for more than a century. The stigma of corruption, cruelty, and treachery will be fixed on the administration by which he was condemned. And one more case will be added to those which prove that insurrections proceed oftener from the misconduct of those in power than from the factious and turbulent temper of the people." End quote. Another proof that Bacon was looked at as a bad dude was Thomas Jefferson's friend Rufus King, who was an American diplomat in London. He was the one who actually found this manuscript in like a random London auction, and he gave it to Jefferson. And King thought it was a very important document and wrote to Jefferson, quote, "As this account is more particular than any other of the same transaction that I have seen, and differs from that of our historians in some important circumstances, I have thought that you might be gratified in reading it." End quote. So this kind of seems to prove that idea at the time that the common narrative had not been painting Bacon in a positive light. But I'm sure there were some, oral histories that kind of put Bacon as a patriot. But I just thought that was interesting. I couldn't find anything before the Revolutionary War where they were talking about like Nathaniel Bacon and like, hey, like he was starting it and we're going to finish it. Because it kind of seemed like the only records they had were written by English people. And they were like, yeah, Nathaniel Bacon was kind of a piece of shit, loser guy. And it wasn't until they found this Matthews manuscript and Jefferson thought it was important and kind of as a way to prove that what they had done was right and that it's kind of almost like in our blood to stand up for what's right and against a tyrannical government. What is also interesting in history is how, as more evidence comes to light, views can change again. So from about Thomas Jefferson's time of reading that manuscript up until the 1950s, that became the prevailing narrative, was that Bacon was a hero and a patriot, and the rebellion was a precursor to the American Revolution. However, most modern historians now believe that the rebellion was mostly a selfish act on Bacon's part to assume control and power from his cousin. Bacon and his men, mostly frontiersmen, only cared about taking land from the Indians and making sure that the Indians would not be a threat. They didn't really have altruistic motives in wanting equality and freedom from the English monarchy. And ultimately, they blamed the Indians for all their problems that they faced in the colony and got upset when Berkeley wouldn't take care of them. The quote, Indian problem in a way that they saw was best. And even though this rebellion is now considered mostly a selfish act on the part of Bacon, it did have some serious ramifications for the Virginia colony. And the biggest one of that, surprisingly, is of slavery. This was a wake-up call for the wealthy and the elite. They saw that they were clearly outnumbered and felt threatened by the combined forces of black and white people, so they needed to find a way to shut that down immediately. And one way they did this was to basically end white indentured servitude and replace the labor force entirely with enslaved Africans. The white elite needed to get the poor white people on their side. So this division in labor and enslavement of black people helped to group all the white people, regardless of wealth, as essentially, quote, superior to enslaved black African people. Remember how I mentioned at the beginning of this episode the huge jump in population of enslaved people in Virginia? This rebellion is actually a major reason for that. And in relation to this, following the rebellion, Virginia legislature enacted a series of laws called Black Codes, which greatly restricted the movement and assembly of black people, as well as increased punishment for these infractions. And the legislature also made a legal distinction between races, further solidifying racial hierarchies. So basically, they wanted to make sure that white people and black people did not ever team up again to fight those in power. And these black codes got even more restrictive over time, to the point where people of African descent were forbidden basic rights like freedom of marriage, self-defense, education, and participation in the government. These laws also establish what is called hereditary chattel slavery, which means that a person is bound to enslavement for their entire life based on the enslavement status of their mother. And this was because white male enslavers often raped their enslaved women, and they wanted to make sure that those children did not have any legal standing to declare themselves free. The Black Codes gave enslavers the right to abuse, assault, buy, sell, and even kill enslaved people. The rebellion was also extremely damaging to the indigenous people of the area because they had signed treaties decades ago, which was in part to prevent violence on either side. And so Bacon, disregarded that and was hell-bent on attacking all these Indians, and he did so. So that further eroded the trust that the natives had in the English government. A year after the rebellion, in 1677, a new treaty called the Treaty of Middle Plantation was signed. Middle Plantation was a large area of land in what is today Williamsburg, and this treaty was signed by the tribes living in that area and King Charles II. Although the treaty gave the tribes clearly defined land boundaries, it restricted their freedom of movement, and they basically had to rent their own land from the king. The tribes also had to agree to align themselves with the colonial government in case another uprising occurred. And fun fact, the Treaty of Middle Plantation is still invoked today to establish or defend tribal boundaries and land use rights. So another, the wealthy white elite and those in government wanted to make sure that the Indians would not ever join an uprising. And so that's why, they signed this treaty with them. And so it's pretty interesting to think that, a selfish, wealthy young man named Nathaniel Bacon, who was just out to kill Indians and get more land for himself, how his rebellion could have such large-reaching and seemingly unconnected ramifications in basically establishing the transatlantic slave trade as the main form of labor in Virginia, and also establishing a treaty with the natives that is still used today. It's pretty interesting. And so that was Bacon's rebellion. I hope you learned something, and I hope you found this story interesting. I had heard of Bacon's rebellion, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about it. This research was really fun to do because it happened 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. And this time period of American history, I feel like I sometimes forget had even happened, that the colonies had existed for a long time before the American Revolution. I feel like this rebellion is a good example of how things that happened hundreds of years ago can still have an effect on us today. Like I was saying, that the Treaty of Middle Plantation is still used today. I think this is also an important story when looking at how and when racial divides started and perpetuated in the U.S. I think there's a common theme of people in power not wanting people from multiple races and classes coming together and realizing how much they actually all have in common. Because when this happens, it takes the power away from those in power and it scares them. Because the power always lies with the people. That's why those in charge work so hard to divide us. But anywho, I'll get off my soapbox. Bacon's Rebellion is also a good example of how we perceive history and how that can change over time as more information is found and more time passes so that the story can be analyzed through a more objective lens. As much as we'd like to hold up Bacon as one of the first patriots standing up against an unfair government, the reality is more likely that he was just a spoiled brat set on going to war with the Indians and maybe even taking out some grievances against his cousin, the governor. It's such an interesting story all around, and I appreciate you for listening, and stay tuned next week as we continue our Rebellion series. Goodbye!